Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you to all of you for coming to today's event, and I'd also like to thank the U.S. federal government for staying open, thereby ensuring that no one has been denied the opportunity to attend this event, which promises to be very interesting. I'm Michael Kugelman, the South Asia Program Associate for the Wilson Center's Asia Program. Ever since Pakistan's independent media outlets were liberalized in 2002, they've taken on a fascinating life of their own. Pakistan's press has been described in a number of ways, from free to feisty to polarizing, exasperating, among other terms. Still, however one may describe the media in Pakistan, most would agree on the important role that they play in the context of Pakistani politics and society, which is the subject of our event today. The Wilson Center has been extraordinarily fortunate to have had Huma Yusuf with us since last September. Ever since her arrival, she's impressed people left, right, and center. She is our current Pakistan scholar, the 7th Pakistan scholar that the center has had. The Wilson Center is very grateful to the Fellowship Fund for Pakistan, a Karachi-based charitable organization, for enabling us to hold the Pakistan Scholar Competition each year and to host people of Huma's caliber. Many of you know Huma. In fact, I'd say that she's perhaps amassed a larger Rolodex in the several months she's been here than many of us have over several years here. She's a very well-respected and award-winning journalist back in Pakistan. She's a reporter and a columnist with Dawn and has continued to write her column while serving here. And you can read her bio handout to get more info about her. So I've said enough. I don't want to take any more time up, so I will now cede the floor to Huma.
Thanks, Michael. I'd also like to thank you all for coming, and I really look forward to the discussion and your questions and feedback on a topic which I'm still researching, still thinking about, and happy to take some pushback on some of my reads of the Pakistan media. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank you, Bob, to thank the Wilson Center, and in particular the Asia program, for giving me this opportunity to present my research. And I would also like to acknowledge the Fellowship Fund for Pakistan, which has made my time here possible. Let me start by taking us back to the evening of July 5th in 2007. Some of you may remember that summer when the Pakistan Army laid siege to the Lal Masjid, or Red Mosque, in Islamabad, the capital city of Pakistan. Militants and radicalized students under the leadership of 2 fiery cleric brothers were holed up inside the mosque after making several attempts to enforce Islamic law across the capital. Tensions were high as Pervez Musharraf's military government tried to get the clerics to surrender and prevent the standoff from escalating into a bloody conflict. On that evening of July 5th, Kamran Khan, a popular talk show host on Jio TV, the first privately owned television channel to launch in Pakistan, decided to take matters into his own hands. On a show called Mil Jul Kar Jio, a live call-in talk show, he contacted Maulana Abdul Rashid Ghazi, one of the cleric brothers in charge of the mosque, and urged him to surrender so as to prevent the unnecessary bloodshed among students. Ghazi agreed to put down arms, but only on the condition that he and his followers be granted safe passage. On hearing this, the talk show host Kamran Khan got the Information Minister Tariq Azim on the phone, and live on TV conveyed Ghazi's request for safe passage to him. Totally caught off guard, the Information Minister simply said that if the militants surrendered, they would be treated according to the law. Kamran Khan then called Maulana Ghazi back and conveyed the state's position on the issue and continued to urge him to surrender. When Ghazi insisted on safe passage as a condition for surrender, Kamran Khan put the matter to a public poll via SMS text message and asked the audience to weigh in on which stance they thought was more acceptable. Those of us watching that broadcast knew that this was a pivotal moment in Pakistan's media history. A privately owned television channel had transcended its role as a watchdog and had assumed political agency. Rather than merely reporting the news, the channel was making the news and specifically trying to alter the outcome of a news event. That dynamic, established about 4 years ago, is what brings us here today, to consider the political and social implications of an independent media in Pakistan that is not merely a carrier of national debate, but a catalyst, itself initiating heated, controversial debates. In the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to try and describe the political and security environment in which Pakistan's independent media operates, and then show how the constraints under which the media operates influences the coverage of 2 issues, the threat of terrorism within Pakistan and the US-Pakistan bilateral relationship. Before I continue, let me explain what I mean by the media for the purposes of this talk. Until 2002, as many of you know, the Pakistani electronic media comprised of 2 television channels and 3 radio channels, which were state-owned, and the content of which was strictly controlled by the ruling government or the army, depending who was in power. 9 years ago, General Pervez Musharraf's military regime allowed for the privatization and liberalization of the electronic media. Pakistan now has almost 90 television channels, about 30 of which are specifically news and current affairs channels, in addition to 135 private FM radio stations. When I talk about the media today, I will refer primarily to the new national Urdu language television channels that focus on news and current affairs. More specifically, I will talk about the content that appears on hugely popular political talk shows, which often bring together a famous, trusted talk show host with a panel of experts, which often includes retired military personnel, retired intelligence officials, politicians, and others, and which are broadcast on most news channels between roughly 9 p.m. and 2 a.m. every night. It is worth noting that these new channels are, of course, part of a much wider media landscape on TV, which includes entertainment channels with back-to-back soap operas, sports channels, music channels, fashion TV, Quran TV, and the rest. There are also lively regional language channels in Pashto, Sindhi, Saraiki, etc. Notably, these private TV channels cater to a Pakistani public that is largely illiterate. Most of you know that Pakistan's literacy rate hovers at under 50%, and that figure is considered by most to be largely exaggerated. According to official statistics, the private channels reach 40 million viewers, but owing to the informal nature of the cable TV industry, unofficial stats put viewership as high as 70 million. What this means is that the electronic media is extremely well positioned to influence the public sphere in Pakistan. It is also worth noting that this nascent media industry has been on a veritable roller coaster ride since its inception. In less than a decade, it has had to report on, contextualize, and analyze an economic boom followed by an economic collapse, a military dictatorship followed by turbulent democratic rule, the 2 worst natural disasters in the country's history, 3 major political assassinations, the rise of violent extremism in Pakistan, 1 imposition of emergency rule, and one of the largest civil society movements in Pakistan's history, which was the lawyers' movement to restore an independent judiciary. Despite the immense tasks the media faces in reporting on these complex events, the industry works under very serious constraints. And the first thing we have to ask when we're talking about this industry is, how free is free? Reporters Without Borders elevated Pakistan's ranking from 159 out of 175 countries to 151 out of 178 countries in its press freedom index over the period 2009 to 2010. That's quite a leap. But there is a flip side. Pakistan is currently the deadliest country for journalists in the world, with 16 journalists murdered in 2010 and 3 journalists already killed this year. These journalists have been killed by militants, by intelligence agency officials, and even the hired thugs of political parties. Last year, it was revealed that in 2007, the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting maintained a 570 million rupees secret fund that was used to buy off journalists and others who disagreed with the government's point of view. The government also continues to be the main advertiser and therefore source of revenue for most media outlets. When displeased with media outlets, the government pulls advertising revenues, forcing channels to either toe the line or face bankruptcy. The Army's public relations wing has greatly expanded in the period that we're discussing today and carefully monitors the airwaves. Commentary about national security issues or criticism of the Army remains largely unacceptable. The Army also maintains a complete information vacuum in the tribal areas, Balochistan, and many parts of the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, where military offensive against militants are being conducted, and which geographically accounts for more than half the country. Both the previous military dictatorship and the current civilian government have blacked out or banned news channels when they've covered politically sensitive events or taken an anti-establishment stance. For their part, the courts too carefully control how the media reports on judicial activities by threatening journalists with contempt of court proceedings. In this context, journalists have to pick their targets extremely carefully. Unable to criticize the military or militants, they often risk using the civilian government and political class, as well as external actors such as the US and India, as their preferred punching bags. I'll get to that in a little bit. These constraints are then further complicated by the fact that the media industry was liberalized for very strategic reasons, to counter what Pakistan termed Indian media propaganda, and to push back against what was perceived domestically as a pro-India, anti-Pakistan cultural assault via satellite television through the 1990s. The decision to liberalize the media was taken in the late 1990s when Pakistan had tested its nuclear weapons. The Indian Airlines flight from Kathmandu had been hijacked, for those of you who remember, and the Kargil conflict took place. After all these incidents, Indian news channels broadcasting across Pakistan on satellite TV channels took an extremely pro-India, pro-war, and anti-Pakistan line. In particular, the Kargil conflict was depicted as a transgression and a failure of the Pakistan army when they wanted to frame it as a strategic victory. After that backlash, it was decided to liberalize the Pakistani media to provide alternative local outlets for audiences, but also to project the Pakistani point of view in a global media market as well as to the Pakistani diaspora. The legacy of this mandate is evident today in political talk shows with strong anti-India programming sponsored by the intelligence agencies, and in the planting of fake news stories, such as the recent falsified WikiLeaks about India. I can talk more about that in the Q&A. The more troubling legacy of this, of course, is the expectation amongst the Pakistani establishment that the independent media will always champion the national interest, quote unquote, as defined by the Pakistan army. Given this schizophrenic environment, in which media is simultaneously unprecedentedly free and yet fettered, we are confronted with two questions. Can the media use its agenda-setting and news-making capacity to be a force to mobilize civil society and pressurize Pakistan's political institutions into implementing reform? Or will it succumb to these various constraints and become implicated in and co-opted by the current political infrastructure and continue to reinforce political discourse as determined by the establishment, but with the guise of independence? To get at these questions, let's briefly consider how the media industry covers certain topical issues. I'll begin with the media's coverage of domestic terrorism. As most of you in this room know, in the past 4 years, over 30,000 Pakistanis have been killed in terrorist attacks, sectarian attacks, and army operations against militants. The independent media's coverage of this extremist violence has been strongly criticized by politicians, liberals, human rights organizations, and international actors such as the US government. They accuse the media of fostering sympathy for the militants and spurring terrorism by providing excessive coverage of attacks. In other words, they are accused of helping the militants in their mission to terrorize the public by amplifying the effect of the attacks. The media is also accused of fostering a culture of denial about the source of the attacks and the violence and the reason behind them, privileging conspiracy theory over fact. One of the most common refrains that has been heard on the independent media is the idea that Muslims couldn't possibly be carrying out these terrorist attacks. The media stance on terrorism was so problematic and yet influential that the Pakistan Army had to exert great pressure on independent outlets in April 2009 to seek their support for military operations against militants in the Swat Valley. The Chief of Army Staff personally appealed to media owners and senior journalists not to focus their coverage on that military operation on civilian casualties and collateral damage, which had made previous operations extremely unpopular. They also encouraged the media to show a video captured on mobile phone of a woman being flogged by the militants. Many of you will remember that fairly iconic clip, and I can again talk more about that in the question and answer. The army also pressed the media not to extensively report on Taliban or other militant views in the course of that operation. The media's decision to comply and their change in coverage on this issue was crucial in generating public support for the army's action against militancy. But ideological compliance is not so easily secured. A few months ago, many of you will remember, the media showed its right-wing propensities in the run-up to and wake of the murder of the Punjab governor, Salman Taseer. He was shot by his own bodyguard for supporting an amendment to Pakistan's controversial blasphemy law. Many argued that the media was implicated in his murder and in the reaction of his murder, since many Pakistanis actually supported the assassin's actions and refused to condemn Salman Taseer's killing. The argument is that the channels gave endless airtime to radicalized clerics who called for the murder of a Christian woman and accused Salman Taseer of committing blasphemy. One popular talk show host, Meher Bukhari, also implied in an interview with the governor shortly before his death that he did not care about protecting the Prophet's name from abuse. No doubt the media has had its greatest impact on Pakistani society by giving national airtime to radical voices that would otherwise have remained confined to some radical mosques and extremist publications or websites, And through this process, fringe extremist views have been incorporated into national discourse. But before we write off the media as this rabid right-wing space, there are a few ground realities that I think we should keep in mind. I'm going to try and briefly list them here. The first point is that the culture of denial about the sources and reasons for terrorism in Pakistan has not originated with the media. Rather, it echoes the establishment's viewpoint. Throughout 2008 and 2009, Pakistan's interior minister was known to blame terrorist attacks on foreign actors and external agents. The media was, of course, required to report on his statements and then base their commentary on them. There's another ground fact, good or bad, that journalists enjoy getting scoops, which is what interviews with militant leaders are. Of course, once they get that kind of access to militant organizations, media professionals live in fear of retaliatory attacks by militants and are less willing to report on these groups in a negative light. The Pakistan Army has also ensured that journalists don't have access to the tribal areas in many parts of the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. This information vacuum prevents investigative journalism that may throw up helpful counter-narratives to the conspiracy theories that have to take the place of fact in most news reports and analysis. There are also serious shortcomings in the journalistic capacity of most media outlets. To understand what I mean by that, let's briefly return to the coverage of the Red Mosque standoff. That was the first incident in which radicalized clerics and militants enjoyed extensive airtime on privately owned television channels. At that point, the media's attempt to present the viewpoints of the militants was actually a clumsy attempt at objectivity. With no training on how to cover an urban conflict in which one group is violating government writ, the media fumbled through the best it could in an effort to cover all sides of the story. Of course, once the Red Mosque conflict concluded, public opinion sided with the militants, who were seen as martyrs and the unnecessary victims of a brutal army assault. Unfortunately, the lesson the media learned from that incident was that extremists are far better at getting TV ratings than government officials. That deference to market forces is often overlooked when discussing Pakistan's media and the choices that it makes. As an aside, however, I'd like to point out that the market is not only a negative influence on the independent media. It is often the best antidote to flawed coverage, in fact. For example, when there was a public backlash against the excessively graphic way in which channels were covering the aftermath of terrorist attacks, 9 private TV channels adopted a completely voluntary code of conduct that then controlled the types of images that they were willing to broadcast. What this issue really gets us to is a question of causality. Does Pakistan's private media simply reflect public sentiment, or does it drive it on certain issues? This is something I'm happy to discuss further in the Q&A. Okay. I'll actually shift gears now and touch on the media's impact on US-Pakistan relations before concluding my comments and opening this up for discussion. So we are all aware of the deterioration in US-Pakistan relations. In July 2010, according to a Pew poll, nearly 6 in 10 Pakistanis polled described the US as an enemy. Only 17% had a favorable view of the US, and that is before the Raymond Davis incident. Pakistan's consistently anti-American news media is often blamed for the soaring negative public sentiment. But there are 2 main points we should remember when considering media coverage of US-Pakistan relations. The first is that for all its claims of independence, the media is often used as a pawn in the context of poorly conducted foreign relations. The Pakistani government and military have systematically used public opinion as a tool of bilateral engagement with the US. They point to the anti-Americanism of the people and the fear of a public backlash to particular policy decisions as a way to negotiate terms with the US. The looming threat of public mobilization is seen as an equalizer in what is an otherwise unequal bilateral relationship. So the establishment creates the perception of rampant anti-Americanism through the media and manipulates public opinion on certain issues by dictating the tone and tenor of media coverage. The recently concluded Raymond Davis incident illustrates this dimension quite well. Once Davis was in custody in Lahore, and his identity had yet to be determined, outside observers were struck by the volume and absurdity of conspiracy theories being broadcast on the airwaves about him. He was accused of being a nuclear arms dealer, an Al-Qaeda operative, a double agent working for both the CIA and the Pakistani Taliban, and more. There was also a really interesting campaign of demonizing Davis. He was portrayed as a womanizer. His liking of naswar, which is a paste of tobacco leaves, was really played up to give this image of an addict. There were jokes about him refusing to eat the chocolates that had been sent to him by the US Embassy in a way to show him as spoilt. and indulgent. And as the standoff dragged on, the intelligence agencies began to exploit the media in a far more explicit manner to put pressure on the US government and to gain concessions from the CIA. Foreign Policy and The Guardian, the British newspaper, have reported on how documents were artfully leaked by the intelligence agencies to the media that made unprecedented criticisms of the CIA and suggested that the relationship between the CIA and the ISI, Pakistan's intelligence agency, were near a breaking point. Official sources, quote unquote, also released a list containing the names and passport details of other Raymonds, that is, Americans suspected of entering Pakistan under false pretenses in March. These revelations, of course, stoked public ire and created fear of the US for unleashing armies of spies across the country. The Pakistani establishment has used this technique before to pressure the US. Many of you will remember the fall of 2009, when the Kerry-Lugar-Berman bill offering unprecedented civilian aid to Pakistan was announced. It's $7.5 billion over 5 years. The bill, in its fine print, included some conditions that the Pakistan Army found unfavorable. I can talk a bit more about that in the Q&A. But the military's complaint was that the US was trying to micromanage military affairs. Intelligence agencies therefore released reports of US interference in military affairs to the Pakistani media and created a narrative which suggested that the US was trying to seize the military's hands so that they could confiscate Pakistan's nuclear materials, and also coming up with this narrative that the civilian aid was a way to buy government complicity to permit the US to go forth with anti-Pakistan ventures. Thanks to a sustained media campaign highlighting these specific points, the government ended up having to debate the issue in Parliament and almost came close to rejecting the aid. Despite these examples, it would be a mistake to think of the media as a wholly subservient entity with no power or agenda-setting capability. And that brings me to my second point. The media, much like the Pakistani public, has genuine, specific grievances with US foreign policy, and these complaints are necessarily reflected in the nation's televised programming. If anti-Americanism is amplified through the media, it is because US-Pakistan relations are one issue where the industry stance on a topic, public opinion, and the establishment's dictates regarding what it is permissible for media outlets to say all align in a powerful way. Contrary to general assumptions that the Pakistan media's anti-Americanism is a cheap attempt to cash in on public sentiment and cater to the lowest common denominator amongst audiences, a poll of 395 journalists released in February this year showed that concerns about the US are specific and grounded in a critique of US policy. 77% of journalists said that they are opposed to US foreign policy. 84% articulated that they think the US is unjustly meddling in Pakistani politics. 67% said that drone attacks count as acts of terrorism. It is also important to note that these journalists are able to keep their concerns about US foreign policy in perspective. When asked what the greatest threat facing Pakistan today is, only 16% cited US policy, which is far less than their concerns about terrorism, political instability, and Pakistan's ongoing economic crisis. In this context, it is worth remembering that the Raymond Davis case became an international incident because the Pakistani media got wind of the case before the diplomats could bury it. The media immediately framed the Davis episode in the context of the populist narrative against US foreign policy, specifically connecting Davis's alleged murder of 2 Pakistanis with the drone program, which comes under attack in the Pakistani media for causing excessive civilian casualties and violating national sovereignty. The Pakistan media also used its investigative powers and contacts to put pressure on both the Pakistani and US governments by releasing copies of Davis's visa and other documents that complicated the US government's claim that Davis enjoyed diplomatic immunity. Of course, there is one more important reason for rampant anti-Americanism in the Pakistani independent media, and that's a capacity problem. The fact is, 9 years into liberalization, the independent media lacks equipment, trained human resources, and the capacity to serve the public interest the way free media should in a thriving democracy. Conspiracy theories remain rife because, frankly, it's cheaper to make things up than go out and gather evidence. And it's easier to get several talking heads to speculate about hot issues rather than to actually get to the bottom of them. The number of journalists has gone up from 2,000 in 2002 to 17,000 today. The average age of journalists has dropped from 47 to 23. According to one report, less than 1% of the media workforce has been trained in journalism, communication, or media studies at the college level. In other words, the media industry is filled with young, untrained professionals with no specific education on journalistic standards or ethics. And what one sees as urgently needed is a capacity building effort. It doesn't help that there's also very weak media regulation in Pakistan. Recent regulatory laws have been rejected by the industry as draconian, and I can talk more about those in the Q&A. There is no press complaints council, no ombudsman to follow up with in the event of egregious misreporting. In other words, there are no consequences for getting it wrong. There were one or two exceptions to that, which again, if anyone's interested, I can get into later. I'll try and conclude now with a final anecdote. I received a paranoid email the other day, which I'm sure many in this room who are on the same mailing list may have got as well. And that email claimed that the US government has infiltrated Pakistan's free and vibrant media. For anyone who consumes this media, this seems like a ridiculous claim, given that I've just spent the last 15 minutes talking about anti-Americanism in the media. But there were facts offered to prove the contrary. There was reference to former US Ambassador Ann Patterson's pushback against the writings of a notoriously anti-American columnist and analyst. There was mention of the high-ranking government post given to several journalists who have previously enjoyed a career at the Voice of America. There was mention of the Obama administration's announcement last year of a $50 million fund for a comprehensive communication strategy in Pakistan, which was, not surprisingly at the time of its announcement, trounced as an attempt to bribe the Pakistani media and embolden the US propaganda machine. This anxiety about US infiltration says more to me about the Pakistani media than about the state of bilateral relations between Pakistan and the US. It reveals that the industry and its audience is fully aware of its vulnerability to co-option and corruption by different actors, whether they be from the military, intelligence agencies, political parties, or business elite. Ultimately, the gradual buying out of the media as a way to reinforce the current political and security status quo in Pakistan is the greatest threat to media freedom. It is too soon to tell whether this is the fate of the independent industry. But one hopes that through introspective exercises, kind of like this one, the industry can avoid that fate and emerge as a truly independent actor capable of facilitating the democratization of Pakistan. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you, Huma. As expected, that's set the stage for what promises to be some very interesting discussion. And I'll open things up to discussion in just a moment. I just wanted to ask an initial question, which is essentially this. Independent, I mean, you've made it very clear that independent electronic media in Pakistan has grown. It's the medium of choice. It's what most Pakistanis watch. My question, though, is what has become of PTV and other state media? I mean, it used to be the channel of choice. It used to be the only channel, the only option to see in Pakistan's rural areas, along with Indian TV, as I understand. But the question is, what has happened? Is this still the case?
Sure. PTV actually still has the widest viewership in Pakistan. That's actually an excellent question. The government, in terms of regulation, has prevented any other channel from going terrestrial, which is sort of infrastructure issues. But what that means is that PTV broadcasts across the country. It reaches all the rural areas. And I think the figure is 97% of Pakistanis have access to Pakistan television, which is state-owned. The cable channel infrastructure is dependent on private cable service providers who have to build the infrastructure, and their penetration is impressive at the moment, but it is by no means exhaustive. They have not covered the entire country, and as I said, the viewership is roughly 70 million. The private television channels are mostly viewed in Sindh and Punjab, but have much less access in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. And Balochistan, and that has to do with just the ability of the cable service providers to get out there and build their infrastructure and sell their cable packages. And to a large extent, this cable TV private channel consumption is an urban phenomenon. Karachi, Lahore, Faisalabad continue to be the main centers of consumption. That said, in any place where people do have access to private television channels, Geo News, for example, far surpasses PTV in terms of ratings. But that doesn't, just because of simple infrastructure issues, PTV continues to be the most popular, or at least the most widely consumed news channel in Pakistan. And there, what's interesting is that PTV has experimented in the past few years with, for example, doing one show that summarizes the content of other private television channels, seeing that that was where the buzz was, and sort of trying to cash in on the energy around private programming. We've also seen PTV mimic the formats of many private television channels.
Okay, interesting. All right, let's go to questions now. We should have a microphone going around, so please wait for it to arrive before you ask your question. So let's start right up here. Ziad? Right up here.
Thanks very much. Huma, my name is Ziad Al-Haddad, former Director of Operations at the World Bank. Huma, that was excellent. I think a very balanced presentation. Right towards the end, you came up with the very important issue of capacity, and I'm glad you did that, because that kind of explains a lot of what's going wrong. But you also said that the consequences of getting it wrong were not quite there. On that, I would put another note in, actually. There is a consequence. I was sitting with a group of journalists here, local journalists, and there was a spate of sort of anti-Pakistan reporting in the press in the past few weeks. And I just said, where do you get this news from? And the answer was from the Pakistani press. Now, that puts another emphasis on responsibility, investigative reporting with good research rather than based on emotion. And I think that and the capacity thing links up together. Huma, your thoughts on how long it is going to take, because the press, as you say, is free yet fettered, okay? How long is it going to take to build the capacity? What is it going to take exactly?
Many good questions. Let me start with your comment about the anti-Pakistan reporting here as a consequence of the sort of tenor of news coverage in Pakistan. I think that there is this very interesting loop developing where many of the conspiracy theories in Pakistan are actually fueled by news reports that appear in publications such as the New York Times and the Washington Post, and that are available in Pakistan because of the internet. And the sort of content of those, often without context, often distributed amongst the Pakistani public through mailing lists or even SMS text message broadcasts that are truncated, summarized, sort of people's interpretive versions of those news stories, fuel much of the understanding within the Pakistani media, and then subsequently different audiences as well, of US policy issues. So there's this strange feedback loop that I think is interesting. I should also make this point. I didn't have time when I was sort of going through my little bullet points, but there are starting to be some consequences to getting it wrong, or to sort of towing the completely incorrect line. And this became obvious after 2 channels were fined by the Supreme Court for airing interviews with Governor Salman Taseer's assassin, Mumtaz Qadri. And they had to pay fairly significant fees in the millions of rupees because that went against the regulatory authority stipulation that promoting terrorism and acts of violence and is illegal. So there's starting to be some sense amongst the Pakistani establishment that regulation and some sense of consequences for really egregious reporting or incitement to hatred must be there. But that's just an isolated example. And to get to your point now of capacity, how long will it take? That's $1 million question. There is a growth in, an unprecedented growth in journalism departments in Pakistan, in mass communication schools. They are widely attended. They have been given both international funding and some government support. But enrollment figures are low. There's isolated incidents, they are there, but there's very little professional development for professionals who have already joined television channels and are working in the field. So I think that we are going to get a better crop of better trained journalists, say, in the next 6 years, if you just sort of do the math in terms of who's entering college now and choosing to do media or communication or journalism, given that they know that there are jobs to be had in this industry, as opposed to sort of a prior crop who are still doing, economics or medicine and then choosing to become media professionals. There's also this new, the US government has actually put a lot of emphasis on better capacity building within the Pakistani media industry, realizing how key that is for improved bilateral relations. And they've invested through, I think it's through the Kerry Lugar-Berman legislation, to bring 125 journalists annually to the US from Pakistan to do fellowships and to train them. This will have mixed consequences. One is that, in my opinion, those trainings are too short. They run anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks, and in very rare instances, they're full year-long fellowships, which include internships at good media organizations here. So I think that needs to be thought of a little bit more comprehensively and thought of in a way that what can you really get out of a 6-week training? So I think more thought needs to go into that, but I think it's a step in the right direction. However, unfortunately, given the climate right now, I think one of the things that we've seen with some fellows who have returned to Pakistan is that in this current very tense environment, in an effort to prove to their colleagues and audiences that their time in America has by no way changed their political allegiance, or they haven't been bought out by the CIA or anything, they return to Pakistan actually more rabidly anti-American and even more irresponsible than they were perhaps before leaving. So that's a really ironic space in which we are, and I think a lot of the positive impact of these journalism training fellowships will result from a sort of cooling of the tensions between the US and Pakistan. But I think, again, as with all things, I'm talking a lot about American fellowships, but this has to be a local effort. Our universities need financing, which should come from the Pakistan government, and I think that there needs to be a lot more thoughtful approaches to regulatory law and a better sort of government-driven effort to educate media professionals who are already in the field, and there should be some incentives for media organizations to hold trainings and professional development for journalists who are already in the space.
Okay, let's go right here.
Thank you. My name is Rana Fawad. I think I can... I'm a graduate of journalism from Punjab University, and I was a reporter with The Nation, and before that I was with Frontier Post. Some of the things that I have heard are news to me. As a professional journalist, no matter which organization I worked with, I was never asked to twist the facts. First of all, my education, I'm proud of that. All the journalism schools in Pakistan, I have visited Peshawar and all that. They impart very good training, professional. I agree with you, there's need. There should be more schools like that. But Huma, I couldn't understand. You are mixing commentaries with the reporting. Reporting is factual. For instance, Raymond Davis, Pakistani media said 3 people were killed. Is that true? 3 people in that incident were killed, right? In here, I just, every time I listened to the radio, WTOP, or read the news, it was 2 people killed. Now you can say that one is making it more aggressive, but fact is 3 people were killed. National interest. When Washington Post published Raymond Davis' story, it held before it published. And it added a paragraph in it that on the request of the officials. Now, as a journalist, that was a surprise to me, even in Pakistan. Once we received a call from ISPR, somebody pretended to be ISPR, Inter-Services Public Relations, that you have to publish this story, and we took a stand. I still remember that. Now, how do you define national interest? Second, the impression I got from you is that Pakistani journalists get all their stories, scoops from military. If you look at Bob Woodward's story, Watergate, you can look at from the FBI's angle, that FBI released the information. Or you can say Bob Woodward and Bernstein, they had good relation with the Deep Throat, and they managed to get the scoop. So, second, I want to give credit to Pakistan's private channels, right wing, left wing. For the first time, I've seen that women got a voice in terms of domestic violence. Any incident that happens to any woman is within minutes is on TV, which is a positive sign. So my question is, how do you define national interest, and how do you look at the scoops? Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments. I think you've brought many issues to the table, which in the interest of time I couldn't address in my initial comments, but I'm happy to take on now. The first thing is your question about fact versus commentary. I'll just remind you that I'd said at the start of my comments that I'm focusing primarily in this discussion on the news analysis and commentary that occurs in political talk shows, and that is much more speculative. And of course, fact is fact, and the Pakistani media, filled with somewhat well-trained professionals such as yourself, do get the news reports right to a large extent. I won't comment on the issue of the 2 versus 3 people. I've seen Pakistani news reports that mentioned only 2 people, and I think that they were specifically tying that to Raymond Davis as opposed to the other car that came in and which allegedly killed the 3rd bystander. There's a whole other issue there which we can talk about afterwards. And I've also seen US media reports in which they acknowledge that 3 Pakistanis died on that day in the context of something related to Raymond Davis being present there. So that's just, poor, shoddy editing, if nothing else, on all sides, I would suggest. But I wasn't there. I don't know exactly what happened. The other thing that I'd like to clarify, and I'm glad you brought this up, is that we are certainly not in a situation where the intelligence agencies are dictating all the stories. There are many times when the best that they can do is circulate a certain version of events or make themselves available for comment on events. And it is up to the Pakistani media to choose whether or not to engage with them. And I also think that their influence comes up on very specific issues, which is what I was discussing today, the US-Pakistan relationship, for example. And also, it is well known that the ISPR, which is the public relations wing of the army, and which is not the ISI, which is the intelligence agency, does have a lot of control over the way in which military operations against militants is reported, because they are the ones who are able to control what access the journalists have to the operations in the tribal areas and in Swat in 2009. So but that works as it does anywhere else in the world. It's like embedded reporting. Journalists go out with military teams for their own security. And so, of course, you can compare it to the way the media is reporting on Afghanistan, Iraq, or any other conflict situation. So that necessarily isn't manipulation in the way that some of the examples I was talking about. And I do think maintaining that distinction between the ISPR, which actually enables and facilitates good journalism in many cases, and is more responsive than most civilian government agencies in terms of giving facts and figures and things like that, is quite a well-functioning organization, and the ISI, which has a different relationship and cultivates particular senior journalists and helps them set the tone for news analysis, not news reporting. With regards to your comment about women, I think you're 100% right. And that is not the only issue in which I think the media has shown itself to basically be a servant working in the public interest. I actually had this in my notes and had to take it out, but when the media initially launched, there was a very clear sense, a very clear mandate to serve the public interest and promote democracy. You've mentioned women, but we saw that in educational campaigns that news organizations used to run and continue to run on issues such as cleanliness, obeying traffic laws, women's rights, health, brushing your teeth, everything. There was also extensive and admirable coverage of the 2005 earthquake, where journalists combined humanitarian assistance with their reportage. There has been extensive and mostly impartial coverage of both the 2002 and 2008 elections, where the media went out of their way to give opposition candidates and minority politicians and politicians from smaller political parties the opportunity to air their views and promote their campaigns. During what, especially in 2008, Musharraf was hoping would be a much more tightly controlled election campaign. I also think that one of the best things the media is doing is putting pressure on politicians to actually shift towards issue-based politics and actually articulate their views and their personal stance on different issues and explain their positions to their constituencies. So we've gone from a situation where politicians just led their constituencies just because, and now they actually have to explain, this is what I think about something, and get the consensus of their constituency. So there's huge, immense positive influence of this private media. Also, their resounding support for civil society movements like the restoration of an independent judiciary and return to democratic rule. Both of these movements would not have been possible without the media supporting civil society in those efforts. So I agree with you. This is not, as I'll just clarify again, I was talking about two particular trends within the media industry. There's lots more going on.
Let's take one more question on this side of the room, right over here.
Thank you for a really interesting presentation. I'm Richard Whittle. I'm a public policy scholar here at the Wilson Center. And I was wondering if you would expand a little bit on what you said about attitudes toward drone attacks. I'm interested in whether the government encourages or discourages the idea that these drone attacks are something that Pakistan can't control, or that they're a violation of sovereignty, that there are civilian casualties. You said that the military has discouraged the Pakistani media from reporting on civilian casualties during the SWAT campaign, I believe. I just wondered what the attitude is there, and is the public, is it widely accepted that the drone strikes couldn't take place without the acquiescence of the Pakistani government? Because in fact, these aircraft are quite easy to shoot down for a modern military.
I don't want to go too much into the details of the drone attacks, which are in themselves an extremely charged and contentious issue. I will point you to the WikiLeaks revelations, which suggested that the Pakistan government is aware of the drone attacks and allows them to carry on. It's sort of well known or well believed that the Pakistan government and military have authorized those drone strikes to take place. Occasionally some happen that they didn't authorize, and that's when they get upset. But again, this is all stuff that we know through certain US or Pakistani government officials making statements and through WikiLeaks. So it's not something that's a matter of public record. And the attitude that was expressed, at least in the WikiLeaks, was the notion that the Pakistan government said that, do the drone strikes, don't connect us with it, and we let the public sort of respond as they will, and we sort of handle that. And that's sort of where my interest comes into it, which is that it's one of those issues that is taken up very frequently by the Pakistani media. The accusation that drones cause excessive civilian casualties and that they violate national sovereignty is one that is highly charged. It produces emotion. It comes up frequently in political talk shows. And it has, to a large extent, established the narrative about US-Pakistan relationships, which is that the US gets to do whatever it wants without having to face any consequences, either from Pakistan or from sort of international organizations. It is also, however, a sort of interesting journalistic problem, because these, as I've mentioned again repeatedly, the drone strikes are occurring in the tribal areas. And journalists have very little access to those areas. And so you get these widely divergent reports about how many civilian casualties really took place, how many, who was targeted in a drone attack. I think this is a brilliant example of where a complete lack of fact or the prevalence of too many contradictory or unsubstantiated facts does feed conspiracy theory. I think it's a very good example of how that dynamic occurs in the Pakistani press. There's also, if you talk to journalists who actually do work in the tribal areas, they sort of they have a very different version of events, and they, in sort of just anecdotally, I'm saying, many journalists I've spoken to actually work in the tribal agencies complain that the national media narrative about the drone strikes is too emotional and it's disconnected from fact, and they actually accuse the sort of Lahore-based and Karachi-based news anchors and journalists of not having access to either the opinions of people on the ground in tribal areas about the drone attacks, whether positive or negative, and that much of their commentary on it is just based on speculation. And so it's actually a very highly charged issue that the Pakistan media is still working through in terms of trying to figure out how to cover it, how to handle it reasonably, and what to do about the fact that public opinion on this particular issue is extremely emotional and anti-drone attack, and sort of, what I mentioned, the problem of the market. You can't really do a very well-reasoned show about the drone attacks in Pakistan because there isn't much of an audience for that kind of rational debate on the issue.
And does the government engage with the media on this issue?
Well, technically the government, this is that problem of transparency between the Pakistan government and the US government on this issue and the intelligence agencies. when the Pakistan government has talked about the drones, for the most part, it's been in the same vein of, these strikes are bad and we hate civilian casualties and we will take a stance against the US government for doing the drone attacks. That sort of engagement has sort of faltered and become increasingly clumsy over the last few years as it's become more apparent that the Pakistan government is involved and sort of is allowing these attacks to continue. So they do, but it's sort of a two-faced, clumsy interaction.
Okay, Huma Yusuf toward the back, the gentleman in the brown suit.
Thanks, Huma. Very, very interesting and good as always. I just wanted to make a couple of points, and the rest we can talk offline. But I think I could write this paper exactly in the opposite way, which is to say that here is a country where 10 years ago, as you said, there was nothing. And now you have these 60 channels and everything happening, everybody is their own boss running around, etc. I think it's a fairly positive story. Now, if anybody expects that in 10 years the military would disappear, nobody would touch them, the politicians are not going to play their dirty games, I think it's really, idealistic. I don't know of any other country, and I've studied the media a bit, which has made so much progress in a decade. Now, much of the problem, I think, quite frankly, well, there is a problem with the state, there's no doubt about that. But much of the problem lies on the side of the media as well. I think you haven't, got into the corruption in the media, you haven't got into the old style journalism, which still remains. Now, how is that going to go away? I think new people are coming up. There needs to be new media sort of schools, training centers, etc. And gradually these things probably will sort of wean away. But at this point, my sense would be a much more positive projection of what has happened. Now, for a military that is supposed to sort of dictate the state, I think they are very, very limited in what they can do. And if you weren't going to find media people who would be willing to toe the line, they would be very constrained. I mean, the idea of torturing journalists, etc., is gone. I mean, you can find 2 cases in 10 years. So I think that's one. The other point is, I think, what you exactly mentioned, and that's also a natural outcome of this, which is this 2,000 to 17,000. Now, where have these journalists come from? Not all of them are trained, right? I mean, if you talk to people who run sort of media institutions, they will tell you that their biggest problem is capacity. They don't have the people who actually know how to run a story. And it's not about, this idea that anti-Americanism, conspiracy theories, all of that is there. But the guy who's reporting is also part of the same society and listens to the same narrative over and over again. So I think it's really that these people also believe in what they're reporting, and they're predestined to believe in some ways. The final point, and this is my question to you, how do you define objectivity? I mean, there seemed to be a sense in what you said that if somebody is anti-American, well, there's a problem. As soon as they realize they're wrong, things will be okay. And I'm saying anti-American, but there are other examples I can give you. What's objectivity? I mean, if these people was to start reporting better on the West, would that be more objective?
Trust Moeed to come up with the toughest question of the moment. Thank you for those comments. I actually fully agree, and I should have started with a 5-minute sort of, praise song for the Pakistani media. It is a very, very impressive institution. I thank you, Moeed, for sort of bringing that back onto the table. This is a positive story. People like me are making our careers there because we believe that we can make a difference, because it matters, because we have a voice, because we can actually influence the way that Pakistani politics is conducted and human rights are, defended and all of that. And it sounds almost sentimental to say all that, but I do want to reiterate that Moeed has picked up on a very important aspect, that this is an incredible development for civil society and democracy in Pakistan. Reiterating that, how do you define objectivity? There is a way that journalists define objectivity, and that is increasingly unfashionable even in the West. Sort of, if you go to journalism school in the US or the UK, the sort of thing that you're taught is that you can't be objective. And so what the training now is, from the point of view of a journalist, is that explain where you're coming from. Just give your audience as much information about who you spoke to, who you are, who you work for, how your bills are paid, and let them figure out sort of where you're positioning yourself in a sort of social landscape, political landscape, security landscape, so that they can figure out what constraints you worked under. And I think that that is the best we can ask of the Pakistani media at this point. What we see is, right now, it is a problem of capacity, and I'll say that right up front, is that many, even news reports, forget the commentary and analysis. I'm talking about news reports. I work in this industry. We barely fact check anything, despite the fact that there are strong freedom of information laws in Pakistan. They're very vibrant laws. Journalists don't even think to call up a government agency and say, can you actually tell me if these figures are true, if they exist, if you have an updated version of these? You'll never see it in a Pakistani news report, that one line saying, you know, so-and-so declined to comment for this story. So it's a matter of capacity and training. So I don't think, and if my comments indicated that I think that we need to be objective, that we need to give a fair and even-handed, depiction of US-Pakistan relations or terrorism. I think these are all very difficult issues for any media industry to cover. And I agree with your point that these people are from the society they're in, which is why I explained that bit about Pakistani journalists, when polled, really do have issues with US foreign policy. This is not just an attempt to get the most sensational headline. They have very specific, grounded concerns about this issue, and that is reflected in their work. I think that so just to get to the point, I don't think that objectivity is an aspiration of the Pakistani media industry. And I think in that way, the industry is lucky to be emerging in the 21st century when even other media industries have given up that idea. But I do think we need the training just to be able to come out and say it. And I do agree that this is a different time. So for example, the Pakistani media could probably get away with saying, we invited so-and-so from the army or from a particular political party to be on this show, but they refused to come. And that will give the audience all the clues it needs to understand why a particular conversation may end up skewed in favor of one group or another or whatever it is. And I think that's the sort of capacity building that we need at this stage and that I think we should all be emphasizing.
Okay, individual sitting right in front of Moeed with the red. Yes, that's what did it.
Thank you. I'm Tazy Schaefer, and thank you very much, Huma. I wanted to pursue a little bit the same issues that Moeed raised. Two small stories, one from a different time and one from a different place, which kind of illustrate the question I'm going to be asking. I served in Pakistan as a diplomat in the mid-1970s during the government of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. The press was not free. The press pretty much wrote what it was told. We knew a lot of journalists. Over dinner or a cup of tea or a glass of something else, they would tell us all kinds of stuff that never appeared in their papers. So they knew how to report. And in that sense, I mean, I can't believe that the younger ones don't know how to report. Somewhat similar illustration, I was ambassador for 3 years in Sri Lanka. During that time, it happened exactly once that a journalist called me to fact-check a story about the United States. I subsequently complimented his editor, who gave me a funny look and said, "Oh, you don't mind getting that kind of calls?" I mean, clearly this guy had asked the boss's permission before he picked up the phone to call the American ambassador. I wonder, though, if you aren't being a little too hard on the concept of objectivity. I will grant you that pure objectivity is probably a pipe dream. But surely fact-checking ought to be something that can be demanded. Plus, pursuing stories that are relatively unpursued. So that, for instance, you say journalists are reluctant to speak ill of the militants. What about some profiles of the people who get killed in bombing incidents? And I would be quite willing to have them continue to do the profiles on the people killed in drone incidents, but would love to see that supplemented by some profiles of people who get killed when militant group X bombs an area near an ISI office or a police station or whatever in Shah Faisalabad or wherever. Is this really a capacity issue, or is it a presumption that their wrists will get slapped and an unwillingness to take that risk for reasons we can be somewhat sympathetic to, but it's still a problem?
It's unsatisfying that this is my only answer, but it's really a problem of capacity. You're talking about editorial boards that wouldn't think to do those stories. I can tell you the story that you've just described, where there are profiles and interviews with families of victims or even families of people who have chosen to be join militant organizations. They're done now and again by independent news outlets, often in print, often in English language print, because you get better trained professionals working for those organizations, and nothing happens. There's no backlash. And those stories, very solid documentaries about contentious issues, for example, the blasphemy law, and the Hudud ordinances, which are laws about women's rights, those have aired on private television channels with no backlash. So there's a lot of space for this. And I think the tolerance levels of the intelligence agencies, regulatory authorities, and government for that kind of thoughtful debate is actually extremely high. The problem is a problem of capacity. So I'll just give you an anecdote in response to your question, which is that the last sort of journalistic work I got to do before arriving here for my fellowship was the floods in Pakistan. That time I was a features editor for Dawn newspaper. And the story we wanted to do was climate change affecting Pakistan. All of us in the room at Dawn, which is an English language newspaper based in Karachi and has, master's degree journalism students from Karachi University comprising a large part of its staff and people who've been trained abroad in journalism and things like that in the room, we all knew that was the story, climate change in Pakistan, the long-term consequences. Go back and look at what we produced and what other news organizations produced. There was absolutely none of that. And instead we had hundreds of stories about how Asif Zardari, the president of Pakistan, dealt with the floods, and hundreds of stories about conspiracy theories about how the US and India had conspired to cause the floods. And the reason for that was because there were no science journalists on our staff. There weren't people who had a grasp of these issues. There was very little literacy about which organizations we might approach to give us the kind of information we needed. There was a sense of being daunted by how do you translate complicated things like weather patterns and climate change and all of that into an audience that has no appetite for that. How do you make this information accessible? And frankly, it was a failure of our editorial abilities and of our journalistic abilities to report on the floods the way that needed to be done. So what you got were what's easy to do. Send out your few sort of, passionate reporters, get them to do a few emotional stories with women who cry. There was no context for that. There was no... it's very knee-jerk and sort of immediate response stuff. And so I'll say it again on many, many issues. I use that as one example, but it's basically a failure of capacity and an inability of journalists to deliver and an inability of editors to think of, and producers at news channels to think of stories in a slightly more innovative way.
Okay, yeah, we'll get to you. Start with the gentleman right next to you, Sue, with, right up against the wall. Yes.
My name is Imtiaz Bhatti, and I'm a student of PhD in public policy at George Washington University. Huma, it was a nice presentation. You mentioned a couple of times that media in Pakistan is independent, and you also said that it was under tight control of the establishment for so many decades until recently. And later on, you also said that once the Chief of Army Staff had to intervene regarding their reporting in tribal areas, military operation in tribal areas, and there was a little bit change of tone, that Chief of Army Staff's request actually did have effect. And during the question-answer session a little while ago, you said that ISI tips media on how to behave on certain important issues, and from your tone it appeared that media obliges. So do you say that media has been able to completely wean itself of the influence of the so-called establishment. And don't you think that whatever media is reporting in Pakistan these days is still a reflection of what Pakistani establishment feels, sees, views things?
I think that we are in a transition period where on many issues the media has unprecedented freedom and can address the issues and get the comments from people. People are less scared to go on the record and talk to the media than ever before in Pakistan's history. And this sort of repeats some of the comments that we've heard in the questions and comments I've been getting back as well. And no, they haven't been able to completely become independent in the sense that they dictate the news agenda all the time on all issues. I would say specifically and particularly in the realm of security issues and US-Pakistan relations, there is still some framing pressure from the establishment. But as Moeed pointed out, gone are the days of journalists being tortured and killed and picked up in the middle of the night. This is more of an engagement where they cultivate journalists, where often if a journalist agrees to take the establishment line on a particular issue, it's because they have developed a relationship with either an intelligence agency official or with someone in the government, and they know that subsequently they will get access and be able to break a news story. So it's much more of a sophisticated playing field. I think that's the way to put it. But that doesn't mean that there aren't issues on which there's a smackdown. But I would actually repeat that example of the army having to reach out to the media in 2009 and ask them to sort of cooperate and help change the conversation about militancy in Pakistan as a very good example of just how powerful the media industry is. The Pakistan Army has been trying to battle militant organizations and terrorists in the tribal area since the 2004 operations in South Waziristan. And then Lal Masjid was another big, the Red Mosque standoff in July 2007. That was another big incident where the Pakistan Army did choose to take on these terrorists or militants. And they found that the media was on the wrong side. The media did not approve of their actions. You'll all remember historically that before going in and launching Operation Silence in Lal Masjid, General Pervez Musharraf actually said, "I'll do it if the media won't show the dead bodies." And he really made his military policy conditional on the media's sort of willingness to help him out in this, because he knew that the public, once they saw that female seminary students had been killed in the attack or things like that, would become extremely anti-army. So the institutions in Pakistan, the army, the intelligence agencies, and the political parties, they too are in a learning process. They are learning how to get the media to support them in some of their initiatives. They have to give them access. The way that the army put pressure was not intimidation tactics in April 2009 with regards to the Swat Valley operation. The chief of army staff reportedly contacted media owners and spoke to them and explained the army's stance and then requested their help. And they sort of realized that, okay, the situation in Swat is getting pretty dire. This was the time that the TNSM had taken over the valley. And so they sort of went back to the editors and reporters and decided, sure, let's give a fairly reasonable coverage to this one. So it wasn't that sort of old-fashioned intimidation tactics. And I think that indicates a progression in the way that the media is able to work in Pakistan that's really impressive.
Okay, question right here, toward the front, the woman with the very nice blue and white striped shirt. Diane, yeah.
Thank you, Huma. This is really interesting. I have a couple very quick questions. I'm thinking of the Friday Times and the Herald. Were these sort of a precursor to this liberalism in the television media in some sense? Were they tolerated because they were in English and not in Urdu? Or is there the equivalent in other languages? And how have they been affected by this upsurge of television journalism? And second, your comment about not having a scientist on staff, it struck me that actually the media doesn't go out and engage with experts in other areas, and is that really a broad pattern in Pakistan?
The first question, many of the editors at places like TFT and Herald, which are privately owned, independent, weekly or monthly news analysis magazines and newspapers that have been running in Pakistan for decades now. Were they a precursor to this? I think many of the editors and journalists who used to work there have now migrated to the electronic media and are amongst the few sources of journalistic standards and ethics and training. And I think actually we wish there were more print publications that could have fed this television industry, because they really did have a much higher standard of journalism and fact-checking and sort of feature investigative work. And you hear a lot of frustrations, though, from those who have migrated, where they just find that the TV medium and the lack of capacity amongst journalists and the staff they're working with is a hindrance to doing the kind of work that they were able to for the print publications. And so you actually get a lot of people, and I'll confess, myself included, who have chosen to stick with print, because we do believe that we can do slightly better work in print publications. I think you make the really good point that these groups, we've talked about TFT, Herald, Newsline, all of these, they were English language. And so in times of press censorship that existed sort of from the 70s, 80s, 90s, they were able to do the kind of reporting and build that capacity, because they continued to operate as journalists in a way that Urdu language news publications at that time were not able to do. And that is because the establishment knew that the readership of the English language press is so small that they're never going to bring the public out onto the streets with an issue, whereas with the Urdu language and with regional language publications, one has to be more careful because they have the ear of the street, to put it that way. And so different rules have applied, and frankly, different rules continue to apply to some extent, where you'll find that as the entire media space has been liberalized and there's a lot more tolerance for critique, the English language press has become extremely free. Like, we can pretty much say anything in English. And the few rules that continue to apply do continue to apply in the Urdu language television channels and Urdu language print media as well. That continues to be a carefully monitored space as well. And what was your last question? What impact have the TV had? The readership is definitely going down. I think all print publications have felt a decline in circulation following the popularity of television news shows. But also, again, I'll say it's a small matter of capacity, where the print hasn't really figured out how to update itself to a 24/7 news environment. So, only now, after about 10 years, are the newspapers getting better at not repeating headlines and sort of doing value-added journalism for the next morning on events that were already reported by the television the day before, things like that. Is there a problem with Pakistani journalists not going out and meeting experts? I think so. I think that it depends. This is a tricky one, because organization by organization, journalistic practice, things like that, it varies. And often a news story, when well done, will comprise exactly that, sort of interviews with various experts on a particular issue. But I think that what I meant was that when it comes to actually sitting down and planning news stories, there isn't that sense of, there's this organization out there doing really great work, let's go talk to them and see if they can help us out. There isn't that sort of proactivity. If a story lands in their lap, then yes, they will find the expert to help them out through it.
My name is Kami, but I write for the Pakistani Spectator. Huma, I think that your statement is very biased, very superficial, but honesty is coming out of your mouth when you are responding people's questions, and I can prove this with logic. I believe, contrary to what you believe, that ISI has very strong hold on Pakistani society. I think ISI is the most incompetent, most corrupt, and most loose organization. I can give you the example about Washington, D.C. There are 3 organizations, like 2 organizations called World Sindhi organization, and the other one is Free Balochistan. It's supported by every Desi knows by RAW, Indian Intelligence Agency. There is one organization run by Ghulam Nabi Fai. It's called Pakistan Kashmir, something nonsense. It's run by ISI. ISI sponsored it. He wastes so much money. He brings so many people from India, Pakistan, and it's like singing to the choir. He absolutely wastes money. It doesn't mean he wastes money. It means ISI wastes money in Washington, D.C. Okay, the other example, for example, you said that about religious people. This is true everywhere, my friend. I'm a Republican. I used to be a paid member of American Conservative Union. I used to work for Republican National Committee. But what happened that Republican party, once it's come to important decision, is hijacked by redneck. I'm sorry to use that word, but that's how it is. It's same thing in Pakistan. In Pakistan, those religious idiot fundamentalists, they are the one who lead, even they are not in majority. So truth is coming from your mouth that, okay, even Musharraf has to beg that if you don't show the body, I'm willing to do that operation. It means Musharraf was helpless, ISI was helpless, army was helpless, but that is not what your statement said. Your statement implies that ISI is very powerful and it's controlling everything. Okay, I don't want to ramble. The other, for example,
In the interest of time, just have to ask you to
okay.
come to a
See the
wrap things
organization
up.
like I'm selling fundamentalist Muslim organization. I used to work for member of Congress like 10 or 11 years ago, and we started offering Muslim prayer on the Hill. But these ISNA and CARE, they are like extended arm of Muslim Brotherhood. So they are controlling in this country too. And so
Okay,
it's
so
not
we're
just
gonna have
about
to
Pakistan.
we're gonna have
Okay,
to stop
so,
here.
the
Sorry,
last point I want to make is
20 seconds.
American media is very anti-Islam. It is very anti-Pakistan. There is nothing wrong about Davis. There was nothing wrong if he was womanizer. Mr. 10% was womanizer, and he is still womanizer. There is nothing wrong if Davis was eating Naswar. He was spy. What do you call spy? If ISI should call him spy because he was a spy. Can you imagine a Pakistani diplomat killing 2 or 3 white people on DuPont Circle and then getting away? No, they would put him in jail and throw the key away. So your statement is, I mean, very, very anti-Pakistan. I'm sorry to say that.
Okay.
And I think God bless Pakistan. We people, let me give you the example of General Durrani.
Sir,
when
I'm
he was
sorry.
ambassador
We
here,
have
I
a
asked
number
him
of other
question 2
questions to
times. No,
get
let
to.
me make, sir, I'm giving you other point of view.
Okay.
I'm not rambling.
Yeah,
Okay,
we have a number of
listen.
other questions. Thank you.
Well, I am disappointed if my remarks came off as anti-Pakistan. I've never thought of myself that way. And I think that I was trying to give a fairly balanced approach to some of the challenges that what I have said repeatedly in the course of this conversation is a free and vibrant media, which is serving the cause of democracy in Pakistan, one that I also hope to sort of support in my own work. So I'm sorry that you got the impression, and if you had a specific question about what my anti-Pakistan stance was, I would get into that. I will just again clarify that I think that I have made the point clearly enough at this point that what we are talking about is a healthy, free, vibrant media industry that on many issues, human rights, government corruption, resource abilities, protests, is able to report very freely and fairly on developments in Pakistan. For example, and I'll just bring this example up because I don't think it's come up yet. Things like corruption. The Pakistani media has become extremely diligent about following through on stories and court cases and keeping the public informed about any government official who's implicated in a corruption case or issues like that. And as one of the questioners mentioned, the sort of violations of human rights, women's rights in particular, medical malpractice, these are all issues that the media has become extremely responsive to, takes them up, puts them at the highest public platform, which is the television station, and is able to get the government to respond to the public's needs. The intelligence agencies do continue to cultivate certain journalists and then influence those journalists and pressurize them to take particular stances on certain very specific and isolated security issues and issues in the bilateral relationship with the US and occasionally with regards to India. That is a small piece of a much bigger media landscape. I hope that's becoming clearer through this conversation.
Okay. Oh, did you have a... Okay. Let's go to this gentleman right here. It should be on.
My name is Dilawar. I'm a journalist from Pakistan. I covered Swat Valley when I was there, and currently I'm a Humphrey Fellow here. My question is about the, as you said, about the media in Pakistan. I would not say that you were wrong or your analysis was somewhat biased. But my question is that, is it something distinctive of Pakistani media only? Because I have a couple of incidents which I would like to mention. Since I was there, I was receiving journalists from Western, America, who were interested in covering militants and military operations. One day I received a journalist from Christian Science Monitor who said that Osama bin Laden is hiding somewhere in Deer Valley, which is a tiny district, and in Deer Valley, also in Kumrat, he pinpointed the place. And I was wondering, I said, who told you this? And he said, there was a report in ABC News that he's hiding there. And I asked, who told ABC News? And he said, there was a leak from CIA. So it's not something distinctive of Pakistani media. I think the media in Pakistan, if they are doing something anti-America, there is a sentiment. But in America, when I told people that I'm from Pakistan, they say, oh, it's a very good country of Europe. I said, no, it's not in Europe. And they say, oh, yeah, it's a Middle Eastern country. I said, no, it's not in Middle East even. And when I tell them that it has 180 million people, they just hold their head. They don't know about Pakistan, but the media here, if you read, it's totally anti-Pakistan. So one point is that. Number two, when we say that Pakistani media is like helping militants convey their messages, you are right in that initially it was the case, and it may still be. But in last 2-3 years, it has declined. And when we don't run their stories, their interviews, we see that militant commanders, they prefer to call BBC, and they prefer to call AP, which are well-established Western organization where journalists are supposed to be well-trained, well-educated. So I'm wondering why AP and BBC are doing it, and why they are not being called someone who are, promoting terrorism. Thank you.
With regards to your comment that the media in the US is anti-Pakistan, I think you're right that the media coverage of Pakistan is dominated by the security issue. And interestingly, I was a foreign correspondent on some stories for the Christian Science Monitor, and one of my biggest frustrations working with them was that I'd call them up and say, let's do this great story on this women's organization in Pakistan, and they'd ask me, no, tell me what the Taliban is doing. And I know that many Pakistani journalists who have worked for foreign media outlets do sense this bias, that they really want to emphasize their coverage of Pakistan on the security aspect, meaning terrorism, military operations against the militants, so that they have less interest in a holistic picture. We can have a whole conversation about how, I brought up that testy notion of does a media serve national interest, and I guess the US media is serving what it perceives as its national interest by sort of focusing on that aspect of Pakistani politics and security issues that influence America the most. And given that they have troops in the region, the security aspect is the one that interests them the most. I'm not defending it, I'm just trying to unpack it a little bit. With regards to your point about access, certainly across the world, one of the things you do as a journalist is cultivate high-level contacts, the best that you can get in intelligence agencies, in the army, in political parties. That's just the journalistic profession. The difference is that Pakistan's is still a new place, and both the journalists and the other actors involved, whether they are political parties, spokespeople, or intelligence agents, or whatever, are learning how to negotiate this relationship. What is legal, what is not, what counts as intimidation or pressurization, what just counts as a, carefully calculated leak or sharing of information, what's on the record, what's off the record. I just bring this back again and again to the issue of capacity, setting rules and playing by them. So I don't think that it's unique. I do think it needs to evolve a bit more. And finally, with your points about the militants in the media and the BBC, et cetera, and other international organizations trying to cover militant activity, I think that you're 100% right that there has been a change in the way that Pakistani media covers militancy, in particular that voluntary code of conduct that I mentioned that was signed by television channels, which has reduced the way that they cover terrorist attacks so that there's less sort of graphic and gory images of victims. There's much more space is given to the dignity of people involved in the attack, and they sort of do wider angle shots so as not to upset the public with these really graphic images. And I think that was specifically the issue on which that complaint was lodged, that by giving these really graphic, unnecessarily vivid portrayals of terrorist attacks, that the media was helping further terrorize the Pakistani public. And there has been some better sort of understanding on how to handle those issues. And so those concerns are going down a fair bit. But there is still this confusion in the Pakistani media on this issue, is how much time do you give the other point of view? When is it just, when is it good objective journalism that, we interviewed the militant commander and then we interviewed the Pakistan Army officer and now it's up to you? And when does that sort of tilt into the direction of incitement of hatred and incitement of violence? And I think that those are very difficult questions that the media industry still isn't asking, mostly because there isn't really a platform to ask those. And I think that now some journalism departments and think tanks in Pakistan are starting to take on these issues of, what is the balance, what's an appropriate amount of speaking to a militant commander as a spokesperson, and when it gets a bit gratuitous. And I think that we will soon have answers to those questions.
We have time for one more question. The gentleman sitting right here has been quite patient, so sorry we can't get to everyone, but yes.
Sure. Ren Elhai from the Center for Global Development. And I wanted to ask if you could comment kind of on a tangential point to your main topic, but kind of on the extent and the efficacy of U.S. engagement with the ecosystem of private media that you've described. So both kind of what I think of as directly training, building capacity, and also placing, for example, Voice of America programming on GEO, on Express 24/7, on PTV. But then also indirectly in terms of having people available to comment when there's these stories that affect U.S. interests, of having, having information available or even distributing information that is reliable and unbiased to try to, increase the level of fact, the level of facts that's present in reporting. So kind of across that broad spectrum, like what you see the U.S. doing and how effective you think it's been?
That's a good question. The US response to this sort of chaos of the Pakistani private media has been, it was a bit slow coming, which I think has been its biggest problem, is that they're still playing catch up to some extent. It has mostly comprised up until recently of corrections, which whenever there was some unsubstantiated fact about US activities in the region or a misreporting of US involvement in a particular event or something, they would send out an email to a listserv that included most editors, media owners, columnists, etc., which was English language and which said, this was reported, it's not true, here's the facts, here's our official stance on it. And then they evolved and started doing that in Urdu and then other regional languages. But it was this sort of reactive email format thing, which frankly, it's fine, it's an effort, it will eventually sort of sink in and make a difference, and it has sparked some good conversation. But it's a bit dry, and I know that's not a very sophisticated analysis of it, but that was the issue. In the face of some very lively debate, just getting an email 2 days later didn't really help push back. The public affairs offices in all the embassies in Pakistan have hugely expanded, and they are very available to the media in terms of giving statements and sharing facts and things like that. They are also increasingly holding events to engage with journalists and just create that sense of people-to-people relationship so that when a story breaks, you feel confident enough to call them up. Again, this is a problem, as I've mentioned previously, of capacity building, where most Pakistani journalists won't avail of that, or they'll find that it's a bit, it just doesn't fit with their story or the tone that they're taking to actually get the sort of, official statement from the US embassy on a particular issue. One of the biggest problems is that a lot of what I'm describing is engagements between US public affairs and public diplomacy officials and the print media, because they're able to engage. With television comes the problem of a language barrier. What's really needed is to get more US embassy officials, US government representatives, American citizens, whether they're doctors, professors, aid workers, whatever, on the TV channels to be able to explain a different point of view and sort of seem accessible and personable to the Pakistani public. Whatever you hear from news producers is, what do we do about the language problem? Do we dub them, in which case there's it gets a bit nervous in terms of what if we get something wrong, and the US government is also rightfully a bit hesitant about being dubbed. Do you do subtitles, in which case the sort of largely illiterate TV audience doesn't really benefit from that. So I think that's a huge issue. And I think the secret is that they need to get some people with basic Urdu out into the embassies in Pakistan. Now, increasingly, the new ambassador has made sure that he's more accessible to the media than ever before. And I think that these news channels that are collaborative, that get sort of voices from Washington into the Pakistani media space through these collaborative shows and Voice of America, are a step in the right direction. They are that sort of more old, what we were discussing earlier. It's just a sort of initial effort to make news seemingly objective, where the other side of the story shows up in some way, shape, or form. Again, the problem continues to be language. Many times the Washington people speak English and the Pakistan people speak Urdu, and so you get, in a way, you end up getting shows where, or the content runs on the one English language private television channel in Pakistan, in which case there's a sense of preaching to the choir. You're talking to the English language type audience. So I think there's a ways to go. But if, I've been asked in my time here, what should the US government do? And my answer is this, is get more more US citizens on Pakistani TV, just to humanize that figure and get them to speak and defend their own points of view and things.
Well, we could go on and speak for many more hours about this, but we need to wrap up. So please, let's give a round of applause for Huma Yusuf. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you. We're adjourned.